Welcome. Thank you for being here with us this morning. It's an exciting day today and a long overdue day that we take up the Women's Economic Security Act in the House. And I want to thank the men and women who are with me here today who have worked this bill through the process and have stood with women and working families to make sure that we address the income gap in between men and women in this state and in this country. Although I'm the author of the Women's Economic Security Act in the House, it was really other legislators who are here today who carried individual bills through the process. And we're here today to hear the overall bill in the House, which is really exciting. As many of you know, women continue to face an income gap, about 80 cents to the dollar that men make. And in some parts of greater Minnesota, it's even 73 cents to the dollar. And I think in 2014, it's long overdue that we really tackle this issue at the Capitol. And I'm so proud that our House leadership and Senate leadership has taken this issue on and that we'll be addressing it today. We have a few Minnesotans here today who want to share their personal stories with how this bill will impact them or could have helped them in the past. But I want to start out by introducing our Senate author, Senator Sandy Pappas.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carly, and thank you to all my colleagues who've worked so hard on this legislation. But we're not alone in caring about working mothers and working women and their families. We're really part of a national week of action for real prosperity across America, including President Obama and the White House. This is really important for working women. We have a very high percentage of women in the workforce in Minnesota, and we really care about them. We care about them from the time they're pregnant and still trying to work and they need a few breaks now and then, to the time when they're nursing and need to express milk for their baby, to when they're raising their families, to when they have medical crises and they need time off, for women who are having domestic abuse issues that need to go to court or to medical appointments, all the way to when women retire and need better security. So this is a very comprehensive package. It's really important, and we're very proud and very happy to have the Senate leadership behind us, to have the governor behind us, and to have the people and the women and the men of the state of Minnesota behind us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Pappas. And, again, we should reiterate the broad amount of support we have for this legislation. I know we have over 30 co-sponsors in the House. It's obviously a session priority for us. And somebody who's worked really hard with us through the session is Deborah Fitzpatrick from the Humphrey Institute. So I'd like her to provide her remarks.
Thank you. Thank you. So, again, my name is Deb Fitzpatrick, and I direct the Center on Women and Public Policy at the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota. And I'm pleased to be here today to talk a little bit about the research that informs both the need for this package as well as the specific policies that are included. First of all, as has already been mentioned, the importance of women's earnings in the state of Minnesota is only increasing for our families. 50% of our working mothers are now a primary breadwinner for their family. Minnesota is a national leader in women's workforce participation. That means here in Minnesota, more than any place else in the country, women are a critically important part of our prosperity and our productivity as a state. At the same time, paid and unpaid caregiving in our state is only increasing, and that continues to be disproportionately done by women, and women are disproportionately affected by it. So these three trends are affecting women in our state who are leaning in as best they can for their families and for themselves, working twice as hard to prove themselves in the workplace, getting degrees at higher levels, but unfortunately none of this has led to economic parity. Progress has stalled. For the last decade, we've seen little progress on the pay gap, on the proportion of women in leadership, in the level of violence against women. So as we've already talked about, the pay gap, and it's been a lot of talk about that this week across the country and here in Minnesota, is about 20%. It's higher in some of our rural communities. It's higher for women of color. And it's a good global measure of how we're doing as a state in terms of race, place, gender equity across the state of Minnesota. And there are four overlapping factors that contribute to the persistence of this pay gap, and the Women's Economic Security Act is a comprehensive, research-based package to address all four of them. unequal pay for the same job, clustering of women in low-wage work, policies and practices that create secrecy around pay, and the motherhood penalty. So just want to wrap up with the economics of this package and some of the research around the economics. There's been a lot of focus from the business community around the costs of equitable policies for women and families, but very little about the benefits. And there's a huge body of research that points to the benefits to businesses of adopting equitable and family-friendly policies. And finally, the cost. On the cost side of the ledger, we've talked a lot about the cost to businesses, but very little about the cost of doing nothing for the hundreds of thousands of families across the state of Minnesota with female breadwinners who lose out on almost $500,000 over the course of their lifetime due to the pay gap. So I could talk for days about the substantial body of research that supports this package, but with that, I'm going to turn it over to our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. And up next, we have a Minnesotan, Danielle Hans, who has testified in committee and is here to share her story today. I think that's been one incredible thing about carrying this bill, is hearing stories from women and families around the state on how this could have impacted them in the past and will help them in the future. So I'd like Danielle to come forward.
Hello. My name is Danielle Hans, and I'm here today because each of the women in my life has experienced firsthand or through others the economic burden of being a woman. When I was 16 in one of my first jobs, I found out that although I had earned numerous awards for my work, a less experienced brand new male coworker was being paid significantly more than I was. When I asked my boss for a fair wage, he threatened to fire me. That's when I realized how little I am worth to the world as a woman. That was almost 50 years after the Equal Pay Act. 50 years! That's why it's so sad that we even have to have the Women's Economic Security Act. But thank God we do, because my story doesn't even come close to some women's stories. Latina women are still being paid 57 cents on the white male's dollar, while they are more likely to be the primary or sole breadwinner for their families. Women still make up 63% of low-wage jobs, and the wage gap actually widens when women have children. The implications of passing this bill, or of not passing this act, are enormous. Without it, generations of families will continue being destroyed by the very discrimination that was made illegal in 1963. The Women's Economic Security Act would clear the way for systematically disadvantaged women and families to finally be granted their right to equity. Please, let's show women, their families, and the nation that it does not have to be an economic disadvantage to be born a woman. I urge that this bill is passed in its entirety. Thank you.
Thank Danny for courageously sharing her story. One important piece of this Women's Economic Security Act is wage disclosure protection, similar to what President Obama had signed into law as far as federal contractors go. But it simply allows colleagues to discuss with their coworkers what their income and earnings are so that women or whoever knows whether or not they're being paid fairly. It was really important to get those protections into state law. Although it's technically been federal law for many years, it's not enforced. So we thought it was really important to add that here in Minnesota. Last up, we have Carolyn Palmer.
Hello, my name is Caroline Palmer, and I'm the Law and Policy Manager at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. I'm also joined here by Donna Dunn, our Executive Director. We represent victim services programs from across the state that assist victims in their healing journeys. We are very pleased to join in with the Women's Economic Security Act and have worked on issues with providing unemployment insurance to victims of sexual assault and stalking, and also providing sick leave when victims need to take time off to address the after effects of their crime. We are very, very grateful to all the legislators here who are standing with us to support economic justice for women. We all know that victims of sexual assault, domestic abuse, and stalking face many challenges. In the immediate aftermath of a crime, they need to deal with everything from medical care to legal issues, housing concerns, child care questions, financial matters, ongoing safety planning, and much, much more. They need time to do so, and sometimes they need to leave work for a period of time to address those issues, or they may even have to leave work entirely. Believe me, nobody wants to be in this position to have to address these concerns. But if they do, it's important to have employers who can offer options to them through leave and a state that can offer unemployment insurance when the only option they have to protect the safety of themselves and their families is to leave their job. We want victims of crime to be safe and to have the support they need to heal. We want a work environment in Minnesota that recognizes the needs of survivors and provides support through its labor and employment laws. We are thankful for the Women's Economic Security Act because it recognizes that access to economic security is also a means of safety. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. And again, I just want to thank everyone that was here today. It's an exciting day for us here. And although this is called the Women's Economic Security Act, this is really about economic security for working families. We know that a lot of women are the primary breadwinners of their families. And if they're not the primary breadwinners, then they're certainly contributing a lot to the family income. So this is about lifting working families out of poverty and making sure that women have a level playing field in the workforce. And so I think at this time we'd like to open the field, or open for questions for either the legislators that are here or the members of public that shared their stories as well. I think there's a couple different pieces that address the pay gap. One of them is the equal pay portion that requires employers who have 50 or more employees and contract with the state for $500,000 or more, so they're actually earning an income from taxpayer money, that they would be required to comply with equal pay laws. And if they weren't in compliance with equal pay laws, then the Commissioner of Human Rights would be able to require that they comply with those laws. So that's one thing that addresses the pay gap. Other pieces are nursing accommodations for women, pregnancy accommodations for women. No woman should have to choose between whether or not to start a family and whether or not to stay at work. But unfortunately, we know right now that women who are pregnant and women who are nursing don't have the accommodations that they need in the workplace, so they're often faced with the difficult decision of either being terminated or having to leave the workplace in order to care for their families. And so there are some other there are safety nets in place for working women who are expecting a child or have recently had a child. There's also extended parental leave, which of course will benefit moms or dads who want to take time off after the birth of a child or after the adoption of a child. Under current law, it's only 6 weeks. In the bill, we increase it to up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave, which is in compliance with federal law. So we're allowing more flexibility in the workplace for working moms and dads. There's not the sick leave that was originally heard in a separate bill, but what we do is if you have earned sick leave, we've expanded the scope of when you can use it to include some other definitions, such as a grandchild. We included that last year, so if you have earned sick time, you're able to use that to care for more family members under the bill. Other questions? Well, the question was how much of the proposal will get passed through. I expect to pass the bill today, which includes the bill we passed through Ways and Means. Many of the original ideas are encompassed into the bill that we have before us in the House today. Most of the original ideas are there, and so obviously once the Senate passes their version, we'll go into conference and come out with a very strong bill.
I'd say we had originally had 15 bills. We're going to have 9 bills. So there were a few that were modified. For example, we're passing minimum wage as a separate proposal, but 63% of minimum wage workers are women, so that impacts on women. You know, some of the bills have been modified or combined. We weren't able to move ahead with paid sick days this year, but we did make some improvements in the for current employees who do have access to paid sick days. So sometimes you make really big steps and sometimes you make baby steps, and we think this is a better than average step.
Time for one more question? No? Well, thank you for coming.